A teacher once built something inside his own classroom that he didn't know how to stop. By the third day, his students had invented their own salute. By the fourth, they were turning each other in. He'd only meant to teach one lesson. What he built instead is still used to explain something psychology has never fully solved. It was the spring of 1967 at a high school in Palo Alto, California. The teacher's name was Ron Jones. He was 25 years old in his first year on the job, teaching a 10th grade class on world history. That semester, the class had reached Nazi Germany, and a student asked him the question he couldn't answer. How did ordinary Germans let it happen? Not the generals, not the officers, the neighbors, the shopkeepers, the people who watched the trains and said nothing. Jones didn't have a good answer, so instead of telling them, he decided to show them. He told his class of about 30 students that they were going to run an experiment in discipline, nothing more. Sit up straight, both feet on the floor. Answer every question standing in 3 words or fewer, beginning with Mr. Jones. It sounded almost like a joke. The students laughed. Then they did it anyway. Jones wasn't the kind of teacher students expected this from. He was young, casual, the sort of first-year instructor who let kids call him by his first name half the time and spent his weekends an hour south in the water. That mattered. The exercise didn't arrive wrapped in menace. It arrived wrapped in a game, run by someone they already liked, inside a classroom that had never once felt dangerous before that Monday. By day 2, nobody was laughing. The class moved faster than any class he'd ever taught.
Students who normally drifted through the period were suddenly focused, sharp, competitive with each other to follow the rules better than the person next to him. Back straight, pencils ready before he finished a sentence. A kid who usually slept through the period was first on his feet every time. Jones noticed it and kept pushing. He gave the movement a name, the third wave. He gave it a salute, too, a cupped hand brought up near the shoulder, like a wave about to break. And he gave it 3 lines that the students said together every day until they stopped needing to think about the words at all. Strength through discipline. Strength through community. Strength through action. By day 3, the class could no longer hold what was happening inside it. Students started bringing in friends from other periods. Membership cards appeared, hand-lettered, numbered, traded in the hallway like something worth having. A few students appointed themselves as guards and began reporting classmates who broke the new rules. One stopped a fellow student from entering without the salute. Another wrote down names. Jones never asked any of them to do that. They did it on their own because the rules had started to feel like something worth protecting. The class had 30 seats. By the end of day 3, more than 80 students were showing up outside class hours just to be part of it. Day 4 broke whatever boundary was left. The third wave was no longer a class. It had a recruitment system, an internal police force, and members from 2 other Palo Alto high schools who had heard about it secondhand and wanted in. Jones started getting nervous. He hadn't built a lesson plan for what to do if it kept growing. So he did the only thing he could think to do. He leaned into it further and told the group something that wasn't true. He said the third wave was part of a national youth movement and that a leader would be announced on television, live, in 2 days.
On the 5th day, more than 200 students filled the school's small auditorium by noon. Banners hung from the walls. Guards stood at every door checking for the salute before letting anyone through. A few of Jones's friends posed as reporters and photographers, notebooks out, flashbulbs popping, to make the moment feel real. Because by then, it needed to feel real to hold itself together. 200 teenagers sat in rows, quiet, waiting for a television to turn on and show them their leader. Jones stood at the front of the room, and instead of a broadcast, he showed them an old film about the rise of the Nazi Party. Then, he told them the truth. There was no movement. There was no leader. There never had been. What there had been for 5 days was them. Here's the part almost nobody talks about when they tell this story. Most of what we actually know about those 5 days doesn't come from a school record or a contemporary news report. It comes almost entirely from Ron Jones himself, writing his own account years after it happened, in his own words, shaped by his own memory of being the man at the center of it. The school newspaper at the time confirmed that something real had taken place and roughly when it ended, so the core of the story checks out. But the precise numbers, the exact words, the texture of each individual day, those rest on the memory of one man describing his own experiment after the fact. Some former students remember it lasting closer to 2 weeks instead of 5 days. Others
barely remember the auditorium at all, or remember standing somewhere different in the room than the official account places them. The story we tell about the third wave isn't a transcript. It's a recollection, retold so many times in so many classrooms and documentaries and films that it eventually hardened into fact. And that detail matters more than it sounds like it should, because the entire experiment was already about how easily a story takes on a life independent of what actually happened in the room. Jones told 200 students a lie about a national movement, and they organized around it instantly because it gave their 5 days of discipline a shape, a destination, a reason. We've done something similar with the story itself. We've smoothed it into a clean parable with a villain, a lesson, and a tidy ending, because that's easier to repeat than the messier truth that one nervous 25-year-old teacher genuinely lost control of his own classroom and improvised his way out of it in real time. What actually made the third wave work wasn't cruelty, and it wasn't ideology. None of those students believed in fascism. Most of them couldn't have defined it on a test the week before. What worked was structure, a clear rule, a symbol, a name for the group they now belong to. A reason to feel, for the first time in a fairly anonymous school year, like they mattered to something larger than themselves. Take away the swastika and the slogans, and what's left is something far more ordinary and far harder to dismiss. A bored teenager handed a uniform, a title, and a sense of rank will very often take it, regardless of what the uniform is actually for. People will organize around almost any structure that makes them feel chosen, as long as it arrives wrapped in discipline and belonging instead of cruelty up front. The cruelty, when it comes, tends to arrive later, once the belonging is already locked in. That's the part that should unsettle you more than the salute does. Online recruitment into extremist movements today follows nearly the same opening moves Jones stumbled into by accident. Small rules first, a private vocabulary second, a sense of being one of the few who really understand what's happening third. The ideology, when it shows up at all, often arrives last, bolted onto a structure that was already doing the emotional work. Researchers who study radicalization online describe almost the same sequence, decade after decade and platform after platform. First, a community that makes someone feel seen. Then, an in-group vocabulary that separates members from outsiders. Only after that does the actual belief system get layered on top, by which point it doesn't need to be very convincing, because the group already feels like home. Nobody joins a movement because they've been persuaded by an argument. They join because something made them feel like they finally had a seat inside a room that mattered. Jones ended the experiment himself after only 5 days, once parents and other teachers started asking what exactly was happening in his classroom. He never got to find out how far it would have gone if he'd let it run a second week. Some of his students have spent the decade since wondering the same thing, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you're not sure you want to look under twice. 200 ordinary teenagers built a movement with a salute and a slogan in under a week, out of nothing more than a seating chart and a willingness to follow along. And to this day, nobody, including the man who started it, can tell you with total confidence where it would have stopped if nobody had switched off the lights.